All right, g'day everyone, just needing to wet my whistle before we get going today. Welcome to week 5 of our Chronological Bible Reading Challenge. It is also the first weekend of March, Mad March, some of us call it. I hope it's not too mad for you. I hope it's an amazing March. But anyway, welcome to March, welcome to week 5 of our challenge. This week we are, heading into Exodus. Okay, so finishing off the book of Genesis, chapters 48, 49 and 50. And then heading into the book of Exodus for the first 18 chapters where there is heaps and heaps and heaps that goes on. All right, so I'm not going to cover it all, for goodness sake. These tutorials on YouTube here as we start our readings are not to give you, as I said, a devotional kind of heads up or even a deeply theological heads up as to what's happening. My goal in these tutorials is to keep us focused with a big picture view. All right, so that's always my goal. I'm going to leave a heap of stuff out I'm not going to comment on today, and only comment on those things that I believe will help you understand the bigger picture. So, before we head into Exodus, which obviously is very exciting, and many of you will be familiar with the first 18 chapters in that story, I do want to mention a couple of things in the closing chapters of Genesis. Don't read over these things. They're not that exciting. They don't seem very entertaining, particularly in light of all the entertaining drama of Joseph's story, that they are quite boring, the last couple of chapters. But they are very significant, and here's why. This is what happens. Jacob is now in Egypt. He's come to his younger son. Yay, they've discovered Joseph, and the family's all back together. Forgiveness, rah. So Jacob is there now, united to his 12 sons. And what he does is he says to Joseph, just before he dies, he says to Joseph, mate, I'm going to take basically your inheritance, and I'm going to make your 2 sons, whose names are Manasseh and Ephraim, I'm going to make them equal to my sons. So basically he takes his grandkids, 2 of his grandkids, and he makes them legally his sons. So from an inheritance point of view, Jacob, who had 12 sons, now is dividing up his inheritance into 13 portions. In other words, Joseph gets a double portion from his brothers. Let me explain. I've got 4 kids. These numbers will be easy to work out. In a normal situation as a father, I would be dividing my inheritance into 4s, okay? But in the Jewish tradition, which starts here in this story, incidentally, what the Jews would do is they'd take their inheritance of 4 kids and they would divide it not into 4s, but into 5ths. So not 25% each, but into 20%. And then the eldest son, or the firstborn son, would get a double portion. So rather than getting 25% each, they would be split into 20% portions. The eldest would get a double portion, and the others would get a single. So in other words, for me, for my kids, if I was to apply this, rather than my 4 kids getting a 25% portion, all right, my 3 kids would get a 20% portion, and my eldest would get 40. Now, there might be reasons behind this about the eldest carrying on the family business, and so he needs that extra boost of assets to really help him carry on the name. I don't know, whatever, you can Google that and come up to your own conclusions. The point is this: the firstborn gets a double portion. That's why later on when you read about the story of Elijah and Elisha, okay, and Elisha says, I want a double portion of what you have. He's not saying, I want double what you have, all right? Elijah can't give double of what he had. He asked for a double portion, like a pizza. You cut up a pizza into portions, and he says, I want twice as much as what the other guys get. I want double the portions that other people have. So this is the portion of the firstborn. So effectively, this is what we see with Joseph. Jacob has 12 sons, and he would be dividing the inheritance into 12 portions, but he doesn't. He takes Joseph's portion, gives it to 2 sons, so now there are 13 sons to divide the inheritance among, which basically means that Joseph, okay, gets a double portion of his other brothers. Interesting, all right? This is a way to communicate that Joseph, again, is the favored son. He is considered the firstborn, even though he wasn't the firstborn to Jacob, all right? He was the 11th born, but he was the firstborn of the favorite wife. So he gets the firstborn privileges. And it's interesting that when Jacob, the old man who's now blind, lays hands on these 2 grandsons, who are now, legally speaking, his 2 sons, he lays hands on these boys, he actually blesses the younger one more than the older one, which again is this whole motif, okay, that we've seen all the way through Genesis now, where the younger is favored above the older. The older persecutes the younger is favored more by the father, and this motif is important to see in Genesis because it carries all the way through to the first century. All right, so there you go. So when we talk about the 12 tribes of Israel, we've essentially got Israel or Jacob's 12 sons, which when they go into the promised land, Joseph is taken out of the picture and 2 of his sons are replaced. So in a sense, we've got 13 tribes. But in the promised land, there's the tribe called Levi who become priests. And this happens later on in Joshua, okay? The Levites become priests and they don't get a portion of the land. So strictly speaking, while there are 13 tribes, there are only 12 tribes that end up getting divvied up the land. So there are always, in a sense, 12 tribes. Is that too much for one day? I hope that didn't bore you. Okay, anyway, the point is, we see here the establishment of the 12 tribes. So that's important to see. The second thing is, before we leave Genesis, is that when Jacob dies, there's this really interesting phrase, and we'll visit this later on when we maybe get to Kings or something, okay? It says there, he breathed his last and was gathered to his people. Now, we've seen this phrase used for Abraham and Isaac. So both Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when they die, all right, there's a phrase used where it says they were gathered to their people. And this introduces us to the mentality the Hebrews have, or a little part of the mentality the Hebrews had concerning the afterlife. All right? They believed, absolutely, in an afterlife. But these people, when they died, did not die and go to heaven. All right? They died and were gathered to their people. And as we keep reading the Old Testament, we'll find out that they went not to heaven, but they went to a place called Sheol, the place of death. And possibly as we keep reading through, we'll see how their idea of what the afterlife was changes. All right, but I just want to throw that out there now, that in the closing chapters of Genesis, we see that phrase, they were gathered to their people. All right, so let's move into Exodus. We're reading the first 18 chapters of Exodus this week. And for goodness sake, so much happens. So Exodus is basically a couple of 100 years later. Okay, you'll read all about that. The pharaohs are now oppressing God's people. They're in slavery, and there is so much that takes place here. We did a preaching series on this last year. If you want to look at our 2017 archives and have a look at that, we did a whole series called Adventures in Glory and Grace, based around Exodus and some of the main things that happened. So I'm not going to go into that at all, but there is a heap of stuff that happens in the first 18 chapters this week, and basically it takes us all the way to Sinai, all the way to where the 10 Commandments are going to be given, and we'll make a mention, obviously, of that next week. The word Exodus, as I said, the Hebrews, in their Bible, they consider the first 5 books as one book, okay? It's the book of the law. And they didn't give titles to these first 5 books. I mean, they are separate books in the Hebrew Bible, but the titles of them are basically named after the first sentences of each of the books. All right, so I think this one's called, this is the family of, or something like that. It's a bit random. It's actually when they translated the Bible into Greek that the word Exodus was given, because the origins of the word Exodus is Greek origins. And Exodus basically means exit, okay? It means a departure. It's all about the departure or the exit of God's people from Egypt. And so we have the book of Exodus. So, of course, basically in these opening chapters, we're introduced to Moses as a baby. We're introduced to Moses as a 40-year-old man. We're introduced to Moses as an 80-year-old man who is then called by God, encounters him at a burning bush, etc., etc. And there are many subtleties in the story that we miss because we don't understand Hebrew language. And one of my favorites, okay, is this. When the baby Moses is put into a basket by his mum and put down the water, the word there for basket in Hebrew is actually the word ark. He is saved, Moses is saved on the waters by being put into an ark. The only time this word is used is in the story of Noah, all through the story of Noah. It's the same word. And yet here he is put into an ark made of tar and pitch, which is the same word for Babel when they made the tower, okay? So there's all these nuances and carryover language connotations that we miss because we're English speakers, but is there in the Hebrew. But anyway, I won't go into much of that today. We come into the story of Exodus. We have the 10 plagues, and the whole idea, and this is where I want to go today, the whole idea of the 10 plagues is culminating in the plague of the firstborn, because God is saying, Israel is my firstborn son, okay? Israel is my favorite son. Of all the nations of the earth that I've created, Israel is my chosen, favored son. And so the plague of the firstborn takes place. God says, I'm willing to destroy your firstborn son for the sake of my firstborn son. That's how jealous I am for him. And the culmination of that, of course, is the institution of a Passover meal. And the Passover meal and the firstborn plagues and all the other plagues is all about making a distinction between my people and the Egyptian people, all right? God is calling out his people. He's saying, you are not Egyptians, okay? You're not Egyptians. You're not of them. You are my people. You have a proud history coming through Joseph, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. You have a proud history. You are my people, and I'm going to make a distinction between you, because ultimately these guys had spent hundreds of years in Egypt growing up as slaves. They didn't have, here we go, they didn't have a national identity. But that was all about to change, and that's what happens in these chapters. They're given a national festival. They are given a national calendar, a brand new calendar. When Passover happens, which is around about March or April, okay, for us it's Easter, okay, so it's coming up pretty soon, like later this month. When Passover happened, God said, this is going to be your Happy New Year. This is going to be January the 1st for you, all right? Basically, this is the start of your year. This is a whole new beginning. He gives them new festivals. He gives them a new calendar. He gives them a new song. We're going to read this week the first ever worship song ever recorded, all right? There's no worship songs or no even hints of songs being sung to God in the whole book of Genesis. But here we have Moses and Miriam singing a song to God. They have a new song. Before there was ever blood worship through Moses, there was song worship, all right? Moses wrote the first prophetic worship song. So we see new songs coming. And lastly, we see a new government being established. Next week, a new covenant. But this week, a new government. And this is the main point of where I want your head to be at as we approach this reading this week. These chapters in in Exodus, is all about establishing a brand new national identity for Israel. You are a nation, holy to me, distinct from the nations around you. Here's the progression. We have, in the age of the ancients, Genesis 1 to 11, we have individual men who walked with God. Adam, Enoch, Noah, and then Abraham, okay? We have the age of the ancients, men, individual men, not their families, okay? But individual men, individuals who walked with God, the age of the ancients. Then we have the age of the patriarchs, where God is speaking and leading to whole families. One family, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He enters into a relationship with a covenant family. That family has now grown exponentially in Egypt. There are now tribes and clans and families led by fathers, but tribes and clans and families. This is now one family that has become one nation. So we are now entering a new era in Israel's history. The age of the ancients has come to the age of the patriarchs, and we are now entering the age of the judges. Because with a new nation, there has to be a new political structure, a new government to govern this nation. And God does that by choosing judges. Moses is the first one. And a judge is basically not a judge like you and I think in a court of law, really, although having the law is an important part of their purpose. But basically what judges are is they are prophetic leaders. They're called by God. They're political leaders, okay? So they do have jurisdiction in the legal sphere. They're political leaders. And they are also military leaders. And Moses is the first one, the first national judge of Israel. We are seeing a whole new era come about, a whole new government being formed, where the family of Israel now becomes a nation of Israel. And that nation has all new traditions now. They have new traditions, festivals. They have a new calendar. They have new forms of worship, which are about to change again in the next week's readings. And they have a whole new structure in the way that they are led. The point is this: Israel is now an identifiable nation, political nation under Moses' leadership. And we don't really appreciate this as much until you get to the first century, and Paul writes about this in Corinthians. Get this. This isn't so obvious. Get this. When Paul speaks about the body of Christ, okay, and that we are baptized into Christ, many members forming one one collective body. Paul says that's what happened to Israel when they came through the Red Sea. Just like we as Christians are baptized into Christ as one collective body, so in the readings this week, these people are baptized into Moses. A whole group of individuals, that is a family, now becomes identified as a collective body of people, both covenantally and legally. They have a legal standing. They are baptized into Moses. Just like you and I say, we are in Christ. So Paul says these people were basically in Moses. Okay, they were baptized into him. And so a whole new identifiable collective body is being established. We're the body of Christ. Israel was the body of Moses. A whole legal new nation is emerging. Oh, I hope that makes sense. All right. Basically, I just want you to see the progression. Individual people, God is walking with God, Age of the Ancients, now becomes a family that God is highlighting. That family has now become a nation, and that is the story of the Exodus as they come out of Egypt and go toward their promised land. All right, I hope that all makes sense. Next week, we're going to be reading about what happens at Mount Sinai, and a whole new covenant comes about, but I'm not talking about that right now. Enjoy the book of Genesis, all right? Enjoy those first 18 chapters and get the most out of it. Bless you heaps. Bye.